Hello and welcome to the third edition of I.O. Hangs. I've been asked what I.O. Hangs is. Is it a podcast? Is it a community call? Well, it's sort of both and not exactly either. It's a hangout, which I guess you could pass as a podcast which may sometimes have guests, but always has input from community members, or a community call that attempts to be kind of like a live podcast, because I don't have time for editing. Tonight, I can see some familiar names from the Impossible Object community in the chat, but differently from the previous 2 weeks, we have an invited guest with us, David Rudnick. You may know David's work in a variety of forms, and tonight I'll ask him to introduce himself in a few moments. But the main reason for our speaking is that around 4 o'clock this morning, the 12th piece in his Exodus 2 NFT project unlocked for bidding. And when the video of this is released on YouTube, you'll be able to see the live feed of that on your left. The unlocked NFT is several lines of white text against a black background, but was released months before Dom Hoffman's Loot Adventurer bags. It is, as I mentioned, the 12th in the series, the previous 11 having unlocked at predetermined intervals since June this year, and it reads as follows. Jinxed light life ends. Quit. Respawn. Shadow playback. Venom horizon. Like the other pieces in Exodus 2, it is a haiku, and it is also a pangram, meaning that it contains all 26 letters of the English alphabet. A couple of days ago, I asked David if we should read out the whole sequence at some point tonight, but as he pointed out, these poems tend to work better being read by eye, and I agree that they have visual qualities which would be somewhat lost in a performance. There's a lot more to say about Exodus 2, not least the fact that after numbers 12, 13 and 14, we will start having to wait for years for the pieces to unlock, and for number 19, we'll be waiting for just under 4 decades, which we'll get back to a bit later. But one more thing worth mentioning about Exodus 2 is that thematically, the sequence addresses itself to what David calls our position as those living in the early years of this millennium, in between being physical prime and digital prime, which I'm very keen to talk more about tonight. So David, please can you introduce yourself, and also please feel free to correct or interpolate anything that I've just said about Exodus 2.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and very nice to meet the members of the Impossible Object community as well. Thanks so much for having me on. I think that the first thing I wanted to say is that I'm really touched by the interest that people have shown in this project. I think these pieces, for a very long time, they were kind of this kind of private kind of bundle of I don't know, kind of tchotchkes or talismans or you know, these little solved puzzles that I kind of carried with me, and it was a kind of a private set of reflections, reactions, interpretations of something that I'm glad that the texts are public now, but I think that the thing that they reflect on is also something that feels public and shared as well. That the sense that when I had tried to share them, when I wrote them originally in 2010, I think for a lot of people, what they talked about was very alien or unfamiliar. And I've always been deeply grateful for the people who it didn't feel that unfamiliar, or that you know, it's something in them, or that they described, or that they depicted, or that the individual reacted to did feel like it was a present component of their world. But I think that it felt like the time had come to share them. It felt like the platforms, the technology, and the kind of dialogical ability for that technology to be read and seen was something that I think only really felt truly possible this year or recently. And it's been a very strange thing, like kind of having carried them for so long, and obviously they're going to continue now for a very long period of time, like you said, 4 more decades. So this will be, you know, the majority of my life spent with this text work in some way or form. It's really strange how gratifying and you know, I really am really grateful to be able to share it, for that to be an experience where now it can become a shared text. These can become shared ciphers, points of orientation, of navigation, because I think that that's a big part of also the way that they're trying to relate to language, the way I was trying to relate to language when I wrote them as well. Language as a gambit towards another, a gambit towards a reader, a gambit over time, something that ventures into this second space outside of the individual and hopes to find or land with someone else. So to see people responding to them or even talking about them, or the fact that you would want to have a conversation about them on the podcast tonight it does feel like a great privilege, and one that I don't take for granted, because for such a long time they were this kind of private secret almost.
And we're very happy to have you.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if this is the right moment as well to mention the thing that you said just before we started the call, which is that this also happens to be you're calling from Israel, and this happens to be Simchat Torah, which I guess sort of chimes quite nicely with what you were saying just now about this being a kind of shared experience, and people experiencing these texts as a community, as a group, rather than just solo.
Well, I guess it's a total coincidence that tonight is Simchat Torah, but that's also one of the magics of doing a 40-year series where things will just potentially fall on dates in the calendar, and you can't really calculate it. But I'm here visiting my parents. Haven't seen them for 2 years because of the coronavirus restrictions, etc. So, just in town at the moment. And just before we started this call, basically everyone in the neighborhood started setting off fireworks, because it's a Jewish festival tonight, Simchat Torah, which is the date in the Jewish calendar where this is an example. I mean, it's something that it's definitely something I wanted to talk about tonight anyway, but because there are explicit components of this text which relates to religious protocol, religious doctrine, and how that relates to text. But basically, one of the interesting aspects of many structured religions, certainly it's a huge component of Judaism, is you're commanded to read a text, reread a text, read the text communally. The text and its orientation against the calendar becomes a lingua franca, kind of like a shared kind of architecture of a framework of language and meaning, by which you're meant to grapple with, kind of the reality of everyday life, and of course the sublime, but beyond the reality of everyday life. And by commanding people to read certain texts at certain times or at the same time, you have this incredible structure, which I guess is proven over time and recurs in many, not just religious, but also in other kind of secular rituals, where you can have this shared form of transcendental experience or lyrical experience, where as people start to build, I think the interesting thing as well about aligning it to a calendar is that people's memories start to align. Kind of certain times of year have shared texts or ciphers that are kind of embedded in the community, and that you end up, I think, and one of the gambits I think is really interesting about poetry is that, like any shared language, we see it on the internet with memes, shared language is meaningful regardless of its prosody or beauty. It is meaningful precisely because it's the only thing we have that's this kind of mutual component of recognizing being. So if everyone is forced to have an experience at the same time, no matter what that experience is, whether it's traumatic or sublime, it becomes kind of a foundational language in that community. And if that can be then fixed in words, rather than just being a kind of rush of sensation or images, then you have this incredibly kind of low latency method of encoding triggers, reference, of kind of things we might call meaning, priority, that can be activated by something as short as a phrase of 2 or 3 words, or a name or a noun. And I think these poems are very much, kind of that's a lot where the kind of submission to the haiku form comes from. This like brutal compression algorithm which forces them to be very short, and then this like double encryption of forcing them to be pangrams, which means that they also carry the components by which they make their kind of illusory quality or their narrative quality or their imagistic quality. It's also like, well, here's the data set, here's how I'm giving you that image, it's these 26 letters, and just by arranging them in this simple form, like kind of that's how it works.
I
think like
run the code yourself, basically.
Exactly. And I think that the most, like, it's more fun almost. That's why I don't really love reading them. Not that there's anything wrong with reading them, but I think that the way that I think the ideal form of reading them is where you're struggling to apply the right software to them. Like, are you debugging this? Are you checking like the letters are there? Are you kind of counting the syllables? Or is it speaking to you? Is it kind of like suggesting images? Is it kind of, are you allowing it to become lyrical? The way that those two forms fight against each other, I think, is kind of, I think, the tension that when I wrote the first pangram, it was that tension that I found so interesting, and that's what made me kind of. Which was the
first one out of interest? Was it the first one in the sequence?
The first one is the first one. Yeah.
Okay.
Is the first one.
Which I happen to have up on screen right this second. Or at least the people watching the YouTube video will see this, but those of you listening in the group won't. Which I just scrolled it up actually to look at it, because some of the things that you were saying just then made me think of the phrases and indeed the imagery of that very first one. And excuse me, I wasn't intent. I'm not going to read them all out, but I think I'm going to read this one out just because I feel like it's quite sort of pertinent to what you were just saying. Transfixed by Zion, the new Jews spam hypertexts, light sick, quivering. And I mean, something I find interesting in my experience of that, I don't know if this is the way it feels for you as well, reading them, but there's something at once quite, they do give themselves very well to image formation, but there's also something strangely opaque about them, or strangely kind of resistant to their being able to be used as the basis for image formation, which I think it's one of the many interesting tensions within them. And I'm also noticing how actually that very one that I just read out, resonates interestingly with today's one, which is, jinxed, light life ends, quit, respawn, shadow playback, venom horizon. So this repetition of the lights.
I'm sorry, Ross.
No, it's fine. I'd kind of finished my point.
No. Sorry. Like, kind of, sometimes there's a little bit of buffering, and I don't know if there's a gap or not. I apologize. I'm not trying to.
Okay. Well, it's all part of the medium, all part of the interface.
Well, okay. Two things, I guess. The first is I wrote that one first, but it always felt like it was going to remain the first one in the order. It's such a in media res. In Fair Verona, where we lay our scene, I mean, that is the reflection of the moment, the reader, right? That's you are here. This is your origin point. I think that you alluded to, you talked about maybe reading Shelley, Mont Blanc before. I think like it's probably quite apparent that Shelley is a writer who's made a huge impression on me, and someone who's writing and position I hold very dear. I've talked, I think, on the Independence podcast about Shelley's particular relationship to light, which has a real impact on me, and his identification of light and language as potentially incursive, destructive forces, which is to me kind of feels quite singular and unique, certainly in romantic poetry, where light is often used as just a lazy honorific, a valorific thing, where it's just like, the brighter the better, the light is good, it's the kind of like the light of the Lord, like kind of illumination, some sort of, kind of like Renaissance. But Shelley has that amazing line in Julian and Maddalo, where Julian observes Maddalo. This is the other thing about Shelley, which is I think like a really important component of how these poems are written, and that is the kind of the fracturing of the position of the observer. There's these mise en abîme formations which constantly seem to occur in Shelley poems, where he's observing someone observing something, and often like he'll have a third layer of recursion onto that. But basically, like, and then of course there's the reader observing on the other end, and there's the writer observing on the far side of that statement in the first place. And kind of Shelley's obsession with this notion of both of somehow like kind of like a fear, or like picking at a scab of the differences between observation and communication. But he has this line, I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about Julian and Maddalo tonight, but that's another poem which, like Mont Blanc, is I just think like staggeringly, I find it really extraordinary.
You're speaking to the preaching to the choir here. I fucking love Shelley, particularly that one, and The Triumph of Life as well. Amazing long poem. Kind of, I think recycles bits of Julian and Maddalo, doesn't it? Or I know it's kind of written at a similar kind of time. But anyway, yes, you're definitely speaking to a sympathetic audience here.
So I think one of the things which I always find strange about Shelley is that I mean, we've joked already about like kind of me saying that Mont Blanc's the first poem about the internet. But I also find that like I was often alienated or couldn't really identify with a lot of the ways that traditional critics would read the content of a Shelley poem. I think one of the things about Julian and Maddalo, which is I'm so interested in as well, is that like kind of he sets up this figure of Julian, who, it's like the kind of obvious analog is that this is the Shelley analog poem. This is the romantic, and his partner Maddalo famously is often identified as this double for Byron, Lord Byron. Shelley and Byron are traveling in Italy at the time. They're writing poetry, and Byron is this dark kind of proto-Gothic figure, but the figure of also this kind of the coming storm, of the world to be, the world to come, this kind of like braggadocious, brilliant male ego that's like steeped in a dark romance that's like that has with it the promise of what's on the other side of the Gothic, which is modernity. And Shelley is this Shelley rather than Julian. Julian is just a romantic fool. It's kind of like maybe like a lapsed conservative who just like wants to just sing the beauty of the world as is and submit before the sublime. And Shelley is this, I think that the most amazing thing about this poem is that like Shelley sets it up, it's this really selfless act, but Julian's just a fucking moron. He's such an idiot. And and Shelley's writing the poem, and it doesn't come across as self-deprecating, because I think that like the knife is really subtle, but he makes it clear that like again and again and again Julian's conclusions are just straight up off through this poem. I think again it's a bit like the way I love the first two stanzas of Mont Blanc, and I really love the first like 110 lines of Julian and Maddalo. I don't like when they get to the maniac in the tower. I just like it when it's this incredible double act between these two figures. But sorry, this is a very long demurrament, just to say that like again when we're talking about light, Julian's way of trying to express, and it's really interesting as well because of what they're then going to go on to talk about, but like he says basically of Maddalo, the sense that he was greater than his kind had struck, methinks, his eagle spirit blind by gazing on its own exceeding light. And that phrase, exceeding light, really, really like stayed with me from the first time I ever read it. This notion of a light that's immolating, like a searchlight, or I think in my thesis I talked about the white light that the atom bombs emitted at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which burned shadows into the ground, but like this immolating force, which Shelley seems to kind of touch upon there. This notion that I think that like kind of again I have to give credit to like other authors. Like I think that in terms of design and like contemporary critical practice, I think that like I think as well of the work of Metahaven, who have spent such a long time like kind of trying to invert like classic platitudes of opacity and transparency.
Yeah.
But this idea that like and again we have these inversions. We talk about the Dark Ages as a time like, you know, like a fearful bad time, lack of knowledge. But now I think like we look at a time of pervasive surveillance, a time of like inward incursion, of scrying, of technologies that are, you know, that one cannot hide from. The idea that like that shadow, secrecy, or things which are maybe external to the individual, so therefore like kind of proxies of language, or you know, like kind of defenses in codes, in obfuscation, in cryptic components, in riddles, in and that's, you know, that's where Exodus 2 I think comes in, but also in the idea that people, this faith that people have in the idea of maybe a blockchain or Web3 or a decentralized environment of both distribution of language, but also the idea that I think there's a dream in this dream of decentralization as well, of the ability to kind of relocate the self outside the individual, because the individual is almost trapped under light, trapped under searchlight, overseen, over observed, unfree.
Yeah.
And I mean, you identified light sit quivering, and you're right, like kind of in this current stanza in 12, you know, we have Jinx, light, life ends, but it's a bit embarrassing the way that light just keeps coming back. In 7, like kind of jagged quartz towers packed above the navy bluffs, mixed nectar and light. I think that there's 5 zones flex, make new ruins, paradise conquistadors, jails veiled by light. I think if you read them, like kind of like the preponderance of the obsession with light becomes quite obvious in that they talk, in trying to describe the blockchain, they talk more about light than they do about code or form or you know, kind of traditional ciphers of how this age is constructed.
Yeah. In that they kind of act as a kind of catch-all sort of metonym for that, plus various other things which are either mentioned explicitly or not. I mean, I'm thinking that this is probably a good moment to bring in primacism, because I'm quite keen for us to return to that.
Sure.
Partly because it's such an interesting concept, which you talk about so eloquently on that episode of Interdependence. But then also because you've mentioned that these poems are to some extent kind of about, I'm saying that in inverted, in apostrophes, sort of about the breach between physical prime and digital prime. But let me kind of say a little bit about that and then bounce back to you. So yeah, I mean, when I was doing a bit of prep this morning, I was thinking that it would be really helpful to have something like a potted definition of primacism, and the first resource that I went to for that was the episode of Interdependence that we've mentioned a couple of times. This very, very good episode from the beginning of 2021. And what I initially tried to do was to just sit down and transcribe what I thought were the choice bits. But when I realised that I'd already written down 300 words, 400 words, 500 words, and hadn't really got much into the sort of meat of what I was, you know, what I sort of, you know, remember from the episode as being what was so interesting about it, I kind of thought, I'm not sure this is really going to be workable. And I also feel like I may end up not really doing justice to the concepts itself. So, I mean, one thing I would suggest that people do is just go and listen to that episode. I mean, I tweeted it out today, the link. It's an amazing episode of a very, very good podcast. So what I thought I would do instead...
I can try and give like a 1 minute breakdown. Like if you want, I can try and give a really... If you have one...
Well, I've got... What I was going to say is I've got a kind of attempt at sort of summarising it in about 200 words. And what I thought was if I read that out, maybe you can then kind of tell me how I did, basically. So here we go. So until historically very recently, objects and experiences of value originated in the main in the physical realm. And to give an example here, we might cite a sculpture by Bernini, for example. I mean, I don't know why I chose that, just a fairly random example. These objects act as portals between a tangible or immediate realm and a non-physical one. By non-physical, we might mean something like the kind of dream space or poetic space where Apollo and Daphne exist, but which can only be gestured at by Bernini making a sculpture of them. And for this reason, these objects acquire a high level of community value as means by which this other realm can be accessed. The historical particularity of right now is that the stage has been set for it to be at least possible for one to be digital prime, that is, to ascribe the same levels of meaning, of community value, to objects which exist only within and refer only internally to a persistent digital realm. And to cite some objects or works of art here, we might choose, for example, some of the digital sculptures of Auriea Harvey, especially the ones that don't involve being somehow projected out onto the physical world, as many of her sculptures are. And just to add one more thing before I hand back to you, this shift is something that you describe in the language of catastrophe, in the sense that the shift will be both seismic and destructive, and you say very strikingly that whole civilizations have been lost off the back of smaller changes. So I thought I'd just stop there and leave you to fill in the gaps, or tell me if I went off piste.
I think you did. That was really fantastic. Thank you. Setting up of, I guess, the primary position. And I would say, I know that it's somewhat confusing because the terms are similar. I guess like one thing it's good to point out. You didn't make this mistake, but that when I talk about primacy versus primacism, and primacy basically is the antagonism that you just described, the idea that the gambit or the hypothesis.
So that was primacy or primacism that describes primacy, right? Okay.
Primacy is basically this idea that it's a gambit, it's a hypothesis, it's a proposal from me that an individual, based on their experience, based on their lived experience, and therefore the means by which they assemble an understanding of their world, an understanding of their reality, will tend to give weight to the sources of useful language, and that an individual, up until a few years ago, the emergence of what I refer to, I think, of independence as a persistent digital realm, because there have obviously always been virtual spaces in society, but they weren't able to become distributed and shared and persistent. You couldn't actually spend all of your time in a community that shared access to a virtual space. We can come back to the one place that was closest to that, and that's the religious, the transcendental religious sublime, again with like Judaism, where you're compelled as a community to read certain texts on certain days, to share that experience. That's like, I've referred to Judaism before as a hypertext protocol, but basically it's as close as you can get to like trying to bootstrap kind of an internet, but forcing people again to like kind of read the same text at the same time. But primacy basically refers to the decision of where that user places the weight of that meaning. Where is the origin? Where is the real? To using a kind of like a loaded philosophical term, where do they see it as being? And this idea that for the first time, really, in civilizational history, you kind of have a choice. Or I mean, a choice is maybe a generous read. I would say that like individuals' experiences are shaping the way that they weight that decision in, I think, ways that may not be easily reconciled. For some people, maybe for an emergent generation of people who are spending more of their time, or more of the weight of their time, more of their important time, meaningful time of value in digital spaces, in spaces that are digitally based. And I don't just mean looking at a screen, but I mean, like you talked about with the Bernini, where there is no physical origin point that one can point to for the myth. One can only return the virtual site of its encounter, a shared virtual site, that therefore all sorts of fundamental assumptions of value, of how one ascribes meaning, a property, and how one structures access to information, how one structures hierarchies of power, they fundamentally change. Anyone who's a Web3 advocate, someone who's talks about the potential utopian promises of this moment, fundamentally seems to acknowledge this. They talk about the way that this changes everything kind of thing. if you just fundamentally restructure these things to have purely virtual footprints, and then you distribute access to those virtual footprints in an equitable or different way. But that's primacy. Primacy is basically this idea that like we're wired to win, kind of thing. We're like kind of like our read is that we're going to make one of these things more important, or that we tend to, based on our experience, that we can kind of reflect, step back, and kind of become observers of this struggle, even in our own lives, and maybe reflect on it. And that is primacism, or what primacist work is. It's about the struggle. It's trying to depict or point to or create language about or experiences or images of the conflict in that space, or possibly the moments for arbitrage or for for productive dialogue. But it's trying to not take for granted, not just like take some stupid position where like everyone's probably met a boomer who's just like completely dismissive of of cryptocurrency, of NFTs. They're just like, if it's digital, like it's just, that's nonsense. What a ridiculous idea that these things can have value, or cultural value, or economic value. And then you have the absolute opposite, where it's literally like, I'll burn a Basquiat to get the NFT kind of thing. Like kind of the physical is dead, like kind of the age of the flesh, farewell to the flesh kind of thing, like kind of these like fully almost like transcendental transhumanists who basically are like, it's all language, it's all data. Like, I can't wait to shed the kind of the meaningless baggage of the old world, physical world.
Like the sort of Landian nihilism that you also referred to in the interdependence episode.
Yes, and one of the weirdest things I think about the last 6 months, I really thought that this was going to be a vanguard moment for a lot of the figures in that scene, or people who are on the cusp of it, to fully embrace a kind of very aggressively transhumanist position. I don't think that's happened in the last 6 months. I'm relieved, but I actually think that the dialogue in these spaces has been much more cautious, exploratory. It also hasn't been like rampantly as I think. Yeah, you see a lot of people who are, of course, you see some hilarious cringe posting of people just talking impossibly utopian dreams of what these tiptoes into these new technologies will bring for all of us. But for the most part, I think that there's been a really interesting sense of it really feels like, in a nice way, like we feel like very simple animals in this space. We feel like we really, it's like when you watch like a monkey touch water to see if it's hot or something, like kind of we're really fumbling into this space in a way that's it's quite charming, actually. I think that we're really trying to work out what it is and what it's for, and how we can build things here. And I've actually really found a lot of the developments of the last 6 months really quite surprisingly, how can I put this? It's the experience of discovering something with many people at once, like discovering it together. And
it's been a really refreshing change from the kind of, sort of toxic competitiveness of sort of Web 2, really. I mean, Web 3, or whatever you want to call it, does feel quite nice, doesn't it? Quite cozy in a way.
Sure, but not just web. I think like kind of like the critical discourse in many disciplines,
right,
in visual culture, in literature, even like kind of like like kind of post Fukuyama notion of just like that we had reached some sort of like discursive end game, and it was about now taking final positions. It felt like everyone was very much like fortifying critical positions that they were prepared to like go down for the next 30 years fighting in, and suddenly just a bunch of like totally nonsensical shit turned up, including like kind of like really disgustingly ugly art selling for millions of dollars, that didn't seem compatible with this notion that like this end game is fortified. There are no outs from here, for better or for worse. It was like, oh, well, this is we got interesting times this year, and I think that it forced a lot of people into discovery mode, into frontier mode, rather than this this position of like, well, you know, let me tell you, I've been preparing the critical theories of what's happening right now for, you know, like kind of reading the last 200 years of writing on this subject, and you know, it's already kind of been mapped out. I think that there's been a refreshing lack of that these last few months. The map is not the territory, and the territory is fucking refreshingly unknown.
Yeah, no, quite. I mean, it's been, and I mean, I do want to sort of dig into this thing that you say about the shift from physical prime to digital prime potentially involving great upheaval, because I think that if I understand by that what I think you may mean, I think that it's quite persuasive. In that I mean, it's sort of inarguable that there are. I mean, one thing I did want to ask you was what kind of historical eras might have something sort of analogous to that. I mean, I wondered whether you might be referring, for example, to the increasing introduction of vernacular Bibles, for example, in the sort of late medieval and early modern era, where I think you can definitely see how the shift from, I don't know if you'd call it, you certainly wouldn't necessarily call it just one medium to another, but maybe one mode or one prime to another, can both accompany and produce extreme upheaval. I mean, just to sort of spell that out a bit, prior to Wycliffe's English Bible, then most people in England had to rely on priests to read the Bible to them in Latin, and then they were able to read it for themselves in their own language. And one of the often unremarked, I mean, which is huge in itself, but then one of the often unremarked on things is that in leaving behind the Latin language of the Bible, an entire kind of conventionalized interpretive apparatus was also left behind, and space was made for individuals to interpret the word of God for themselves, or at least in theory, to do that. And I guess one reading of the chaos that ensued for the next couple of centuries was that this had to do with either fighting for or resisting that kind of shift on a political level. But I mean, in a way, the thing that I'm kind of not most interested in, but sort of at least partly interested in that episode, or that kind of episode, is how absolutely seismic it must have felt to be someone who, let's suppose there is a sort of putative individual who previously felt the entire kind of hermeneutic authority of the Catholic Church bearing down on them through what the priest was telling them to understand by the meaning of certain verses, to then being able to, let's say they lived in a sort of Lollard Wycliffeite community where they were encouraged to understand the Bible for themselves and preach for themselves. Just how incredibly different their day-to-day lived existence must have felt. Which, I mean, that's possibly a sort of very personal interpretation of a kind of half-remembered thing that made an impression on me quite a while ago. But it's, I kind of wondered whether you were thinking about something along these lines in terms of the shift from physical prime to digital prime, in terms of the role that being primarily physical to primarily digital might have in everyday lived experience, especially over a kind of like a long durée. I mean, not necessarily in this very moment now, but then in the course of the 20, 30 years that the Exodus NFTs will be unlocked in. Or am I way off base? I mean, I this is, like I said, just like a kind of personal response to it.
I not only do I, so to want to look for examples of cataclysm or examples of where a sudden and unforeseen shift in the means, in the technology of information distribution, in the hierarchy of information or language distribution in society changes. Yes, the Gutenberg Bible, like kind of the idea of like kind of the Vulgate Bible, like kind of like Bibles printed in the vernacular that could be read but that could also be distributed. That's the 1450s. I think that one thing which is kind of underobserved historically about the period that follows, I mean, let's just quickly walk through the next 50 years. well, actually, let's walk through the next 70 years, which is approximately the lifespan, although obviously you'd have to do pretty well to reach 70 back in, if you were born in 1450. But if you were born in 1450, the Gutenberg Bible is printed, and within 2 generations, you have mass distribution of the Bible in the vernacular, kind of the printed book, which becomes, it's still something which is, it's a luxury commodity. The middle class or very wealthy can access them, but what you definitely have is it doesn't become protected language outside the church. But just as importantly, I would say, also in that period, you have, from a very, very, very low and still unheralded level, kind of quite commercial tech, the refinement of image reproduction technologies, wood blocks, which become illustrations in those books, of intaglio printing in northern Italy, which by around 1475, 1480 is starting to approach a level of fineness where you're getting not photorealism, but you're moving away from crude symbolic depictions of scenes towards things which are attempting to bring in some of the kind of proto-realist components of northern humanism into image making. And basically you're seeing a society in Flanders, in Germany, in France, in northern Italy, where the public are seeing images for the first time outside of a church. They're seeing images in private. They're looking at scenes, and they're also, a technology has emerged because it can't be any more controlled or censored by the church in the way that it was before. You're starting to see categories of image emerge which are not religious images. So seeing kind of pornography being distributed for the first time. You're seeing depictions of everyday life, and the groundwork for kind of like the vernacular image, and that people starting to basically turn their gaze away from God in certain ways to see potentially, it's not necessarily a secularizing of the gaze, because you may see God in everyday life, but you're starting to look in places the church can't control. You're starting to erode the power of the church to command and compel the gaze, and therefore command and compel the set of images, the set of symbols through which one assembles the real. Now, this goes straight back to primacism, because this is the idea as well.
That's such a good example. That's a really, really good example.
Who controls the sources and sites of myth? Who controls the sources and sites of meaning in society? If those are agglomerated, as they were in the late 20th century, into basically the ciphers of megacapital and media conglomerates, they just controlled the broadcast image. You have the major labels in the record industry controlling, kind of popular song, but then, kind of essentially the folkloric component of the soundtrack to everyday life. You have these sources of image in terms of contemporary art, late contemporary art, that are excessively expensive, often deliberately massive, very heavy, huge paintings that require massive real estate to display, massive, monumental, spectacular installations of ludicrous. He's Hearst, his sculptures in Venice a few years ago, which now feel phenomenally out of date, kind of 60-foot bronzes and stuff. But this is the mocking kind of colossi of megacapital, which also require megacapital to even display them, let alone own them. But this is a control mechanic, and this is a centralizing mechanic, and it's very, very prime for disruption. It's very, kind of, again, one of the reasons why I think we've got such a compelling antagonism between social and economic systems that are reliant on the existence of physical primes as their consumers. So the traditional art market, for example, but also certain forms of traditional real estate or of social or cultural capital. And then you also have the emergence of, at least this year, the potential markets which require digital primes to be drivers, kind of the market for a beeple or something. It's basically a massive bet on the idea that this is the future of the source of myth, the source of image making. When you say a beeple is potentially worth $75 million or whatever, you're kind of saying that I think that the next generation of Warhols, the next generation of Basquiat's will reside in digital space in a really simple way. Or you're pumping and dumping the price of a commodity that you control, and you're of course I'm not naive enough to suggest that there's no component of that as well. But that is to say, kind of going back to that time, going back to the late 14th to 15th century, I think it's really important to focus on the image, and I won't talk about it in this chat, but that my background in art history is, kind of the area that I studied under Christopher Wood, and that what I wrote my thesis on is the altarpiece painting and printmaking of the Northern Renaissance, specifically of that generation, like kind of starting with kind of Durer's forebears and then Durer, and then the artists that grew up on Durer. So it's like Gen X who had punk records to listen to, if that makes sense. I kind of like the way that you get this gap where the kids who are in their bedroom listening to the first wave of vanguard, avant-garde artists get their own toolkit to approach now, like a kind of not a pedestrian avant-garde, but like a default avant-garde. Like kind of they have the opportunity now to do that without it necessarily being like groundbreaking in and of itself. Yeah. So they can then explore the fundamentals of that space. And I think that it's not a coincidence. My thesis is kind of, but it's not just my thesis. I think that, like kind of it's not even a controversial thing to say anymore from an art historical perspective, but that the component of the Northern Reformation, Protestant Reformation, that is iconoclastic, that is it's not just that Luther is an economic reformer, that you also have the Beadlesturm and similar events that take place in the decade of like the 15 teens, where basically they try and pull all the art out of the churches, because the art of that generation, the ones who listened to the first punks, was wildly, aggressively, like kind of pushing the vanguard of what, if you're a big conservative about like basically centralized church power, and you've got a group of artists who are interested in sex, in violence, in viscera, like kind of in what to them appears like the opposite of anything the Catholic Church could control, and that's why it becomes the Protestant Church, basically this like image for the church, is that they seem to have fallen in love with the mystery of a different kind of real. And I think that again you can say like that's the kind of cataclysm, but I want to follow this one thing. That's the kind of cataclysm that one could think of when talking about the idea of like how a society might be radically reshaped by this. And the church is it's like the Roman Empire. The church is like it's like maybe America in the last 30 years. You go from being this like all this solid melts into air. It was immortal, and then it suddenly was no more. Like kind of it was impossible to imagine its demise until it was gone, kind of thing. And I think that all kinds of things whose demise is impossible for us to imagine may be suddenly gone in our lifetime. Yeah. But the other thing I'll say, which is really important, I've just walked through the fact that I'm a art historian, or not an art historian, but I studied art history in a Western university. I grew up in a Western cultural vernacular. I'm talking about Europe in the 15th century. If you really want to ask me the question, what are examples of cataclysm? Well, maybe there's a lot of cultures that didn't make it to the 21st century to have spokespeople standing here for them, talking about what happened 500 years ago. Some of them had a cataclysm that literally ended them. Many of them did. The vast majority of cultures are no longer with us, not in a way that's, like kind of that people feel compelled to speak on their behalf. And, I think that there's this notion actually that it's really fascinating to me, like kind of, again, this like kind of, like we're talking about this sudden movement from the end of history to the fright of seeing one's own reflection and looking sick in the mirror or something. This sudden moment of a quite radical pivot of feeling like one was in a fortified endgame to feeling like one's actually witnessing somebody else take the king is really an interesting transition. A really, I use interesting in the interesting time sense, where it's like it's a privilege and a nightmare for us to live through that. But I think that it's you might be able to hear the fireworks have started again. But also that was kind of, I guess, one of the things that motivated me to start writing when I wrote the Exodus series, in that I was desperately trying to find a form that I could communicate or leave in language something that in this moment of turbulence or moment of loss, potentially something that could be solid enough, well encrypted enough, like kind of well optimized enough to survive this transition. It's like it's got to be hard as diamond kind of thing. It's like you have to like cut all the unnecessary letters out. You have to make sure it's got like I think they're almost like these strange survival capsules.
Yeah.
Like bizarre, hardy, like I don't know if like something between like a kind of like a diamond and a Cliff Bar, where it's just that they're just reduced to their bare nutrients kind of thing, and arranged in this stack and then encoded on a chain to hopefully survive whatever this 40-year period they have to traverse. But like the obvious thing to say is that I will be 75 when this series ends, if I'm still alive. I think that the beautiful thing, one of the things that I love about poetry, is the way in which it's like it's a kind of giving up of the body, it's a giving up of the life, in that like you let language live and you no longer need to speak it into existence. You write it down, and therefore it can remain independent of the speaker, it can remain independent of the originator, and that this is a gambit not against death, but in favour of other lives.
Which is definitely a kind of fascinating aspect of the prospect of these NFTs being unlocked with increasing gaps of time between them. I mean, one of the questions that I think they provoke is, will Ethereum still exist in 40 years? Will it be something that we have to use an emulator to even be able to to read, or will it just be a toy by then, despite being a store of such great value by now?
There's a very real possibility. I think, like maybe even the likelihood the
series
will fail.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is that it is quite likely that it will befall that fate will befall it.
Yes, and that it's a gambit that's out of my hands to a certain degree, but also one in which, like, I think that's a dalliance, that's a sallying forth, right? That's like a kind of a charging out to meet time, to meet, like, you've set your chain of events in motion, and that they will be met by what comes. I think that's always an interesting aspect of the work for me, because it speaks to the fundamental nature of any poem, and that, like I said, like you set your chain of events in motion, you set your words, and then you set them to a reader. Like the reader may encounter them or they may not, and that their affect is out of your hands, that you can only set the words. I really find that aspect of poetry versus orality that's really interesting to me. And it's also why it's like, I'm not sure it's necessary for anyone to recite these poems, that they're like, well, they've kind of chosen a different form of, even in this time lock structure, it's like an alternative to recitation, where it's like they've picked a fate, they've picked a position in which they will be encountered, and the gambit is that that I or they think that is a reasonable means of encounter that will aid their use factor as poetry. Yeah.
Well, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I thought this might be a nice moment to invite any questions that we have from those listening. We've got about 15-20 people in the kind of live call here, and yeah, if anyone's got a question or something they want to bring up, then feel free to unmute yourself.
If you want to mute and unmute yourself quickly, then that can be like a flash, like raise your hand kind of thing, like then we can see that someone's like raised their hand kind of thing.
Well, we've got
we'll see my go green.
Oh, try, yeah. So, some system like that. I'm sure we'll work it out. We've actually got a kind of question in the text chat already from Folia, which is, what's the condensed David Rudnick digital prime reading list?
Ooh.
I've actually got one that I could sort of suggest while you have a think about that, David, which is it's not exactly a kind of doesn't necessarily belong on the digital prime reading list per se, but it did occur to me earlier today that actually that documentary about Pepe, Feels Good Man, is actually a really good telling of the traumatic passage from physical prime to digital prime, which many of you have probably seen this already, but I'm especially thinking of that middle part of the documentary about the kind of memeing of Trump into existence. And I thought it was quite interesting that you were bringing things back to the control or inability to control images of the early modern Catholic Church, because I feel like there's something similar happening in a very different kind of register in that particular kind of fate of Pepe. So that's one thing that I'd add to that list, maybe.
I think that's a really lovely suggestion. I mean, my ones might be a bit more boring in the sense that, like, off the top of my head, I think ones that are worth reading. I mentioned that I studied under Christopher Wood at Yale. I do think that Christopher Wood is a really extraordinary thinker and writer, and that, like, I think that, like, Forgery, Replica, Fiction, which is quite hard to get hold of. It's a U Chicago book and it's out of print. But I spoke to Chris last year, and I think that they are going to do another edition of this.
Great.
That's an amazing book, which basically talks about, it's a really good primer. It obviously won't talk directly about digital crime, but it talks about the way in which during this period that we talked about a bit, where you invent the multiple, you invent, like, the category of the distributed image or the distributed text, because that's another thing which printing invents. I think this is one of the moments where it's like, I can't understate how formative this was in my life, studying under Chris and basically realizing what printing does to the West, but also to so much of our foundations of what we now think of as default reality, which is you move from a world where literally, if you had a chair in your house, a craftsman made that chair by hand, kind of thing. If you had a book in your house or in your church, because you probably weren't rich enough to own a book, it was written by a scribe by hand. It was, like, kind of sewn together by an artisan. Just the idea that, like, and that something was beautiful or valuable because it was manifestly better or had more craft than something else, right? Let's say you went into a map dealer or something. Let's say you're a wealthy burger and you want to buy, like, a kind of, like something, you see, like, 20 things on the shelf. They are all different, and that they are different in ways that might lead to a vector of a hierarchy, because one might have more skill or more rich techniques. Now imagine walking into an Apple store and seeing that display of, 100 iPhone boxes on the shelf in front of you, and that they manifest power because they are the same. And I know this is a really quotidian point to be making, but, like, what the moment of the first moment ever of that realization was like in culture, where like, kind of maybe in Gutenberg's workshop, where they have, like, 50 copies of the Bible ready to be distributed or whatever, and they're looking at them and they're all the same, or they're good because they're the same. And that other people might desire it not because it's different, because it's the same. And that this creates a totally new means. And I think when people talk about the power of blockchain, the power of the ledger, and the power of distribution of, like, how that's going to empower people, they're having a moment like looking at Gutenberg's 50 Bibles in his workshop, and they're realizing that this is a miracle that's happening in some ways for the first time, because something that was a hierarchy before is not a hierarchy anymore, and that doesn't make it less powerful. It's got exactly as much power as it had before, but the power is being distributed completely differently.
Which also accounts for some of the kind of trauma reactions to blockchain and to crypto. People projecting kind of real fear onto. Yeah.
Well, they're absolutely right in that it is an overt threat to a lot of models, which for many people provide stability, comfort, like, kind of, and it's also quite clear from the kind of turmoil of the ages that tend to follow kind of paradigm shifts like this, that a lot of the ways that legacy components of society provided stability or weren't necessary for certain types of security, when you rug pull all of them at once, you also lose the good ones, kind of thing. Like, kind of, even if only 20% of them were good and you're getting rid of something that's 80% bad, you will have to suffer the consequences of losing the 20% that was good. And so, there's all these kind of collateral social shock events that happen as a result of that, which I think we're going to now live through, and it will be, like, we'll have to be quite fleet of foot culturally to respond to it, or possibly proactive. And that's also another thing which I think is, like, again, I know we're at the end of time. That's a pregnant phrase, but I meant end of time in the context of this discussion. that, for these the poems, for example, they were written in 2010. I do think that I'm really interested in works right now that, there's a whole bunch of shit in the NFT space where it's like kind of cartoon avatar projects and stuff, and it's about, it's fundamentally, if one was to read these things as works of art, there is the same realization being made very often, which is we have a product that has a new social affect. There's high demand for it, and there's an influx of capital that can be applied to it. So I can make a lot of money selling avatars or selling images to a community that have community value. But and that's such a near field observation that the telescope of that observation is literally hours long, where it's basically I will release this and I will make a lot of money. And I think that which is fine. There's a very fucking basic and not particularly interesting set of observations to start to kind of orient a community around. I'm really interested in works right now that are willing to fumble, even kind of embarrassingly, into the ridiculous void of the unknown that's, I think, ahead of us. I really am interested in people talking about future again, or playing this weird game, I guess, like the Exodus does with placing things into the future, or kind of sallying forth to meet the future. Because I do think that even in the failures or even in the bad efforts to do that, I think it's why sci-fi was so formative for the late 20th century. You get a framework around which actual reality will orient, even if it's in opposition to. You have something. You have these little granules of language. I think, to finish I guess kind of to wrap up from my side, nothing moves me more than the moments, it's as far as this work goes, Exodus 2, where if a reader identifies a phrase that has value to them, even just a 2-word thing, and when they say I just I really love Vibe Sarcophagi or something, or Quadratic Empire, or kind of, I had friends, some of them who one, I think kind of when I first did them in 2010, a friend of mine who was a writer, really they weren't even really able to articulate it, but the stanza, I think it's 15, maybe it's later actually, 17, about Plato's cave, it really resonated with them in a deep way, and they just kept coming back to that phrase about Plato's cave, which I love as well because of the ambiguity in the word about, pertaining to, or literally around. There's that great meme image, right? It's become a good meme, Plato's cave image, where it's there's the people looking at the shadow play, then there's the people who are actually making the shadows, then there's someone crawling out, and then you'll have the kind of galaxy brain nonsense, which is actually outside the cave kind of thing. But that's again kind of one of these beautiful things about this moment of where shit posting is actually deeply profound, where it's in a way with digital crime, for a lot of these people, they really are stepping out of one Plato's cave into something where the real might be as stupid as fucking Pepe's. They may literally be leaving Plato's cave into a world of Pepe's. That might actually be the culture. We might go from Bernini and Shelley to Pepe world. That might actually be the next 40 years of humanity. So, I think that meme is, I'm not saying it will be, but I think those memes are really interesting.
And they're kind of predictive, or kind of almost, what's the word? Oracular kind of quality.
Yeah, but exactly. I think that I'm ready for that again. I'm ready for the embarrassment of the oracular, of the nonsense of kind of rhapsody and prophecy, in that I think our culture's desperately missed it. I think that again, this end game perspective within capitalism was brutal in eliminating any vectors of emancipation or imagination from things that could be applied to real commodities. And I think that moving into the unreal is one thing that a lot of the art projects of this moment have in common. That kind of whether it's people talking about the metaverse, or whether it's people talking in terms of digital prime about kind of new as yet unbuilt communities, or whether it's even the aspect of the Exodus where it's just trying to talk about the blockchain in 40 years. like kind of things that are not real, not yet real, may never be real. I think that's a kind of valid terrain which art is entitled to return to at this point and explore. And I'm interested to see what language emerges there.
I mean, it's interesting. We've had one final question which I'm going to read out. While you were saying quite a few of the things that you covered just then, I felt that they sounded a bit like a partial answer to this, which I'm just going to read this out. This is from Layla. I've been struggling with writing. I find it vital to write fiction, but at the same time, I wonder, does it really have a future? And also, how can we contribute to giving writing a new breath, sort of? Especially that everything seems to have been already thought and written. And yeah, I mean, that's a question that I think would require possibly a whole extra hour to go into in appropriate depth. But it was that phrase that you said about bursting out of Plato's cave, where you may have been brushing shoulders with Shelley and Byron and whoever, and when you get out of it, you're with Pepe the Frog. That kind of resonated with me when I was thinking about my answer to this question. In that it's hard to articulate exactly, but I feel like something of what Layla may be getting at there is the sense that fiction novels, especially, are it's, I suppose, a commonplace now to say that they're a dying form that have been killed over and over since Joyce, since Beckett, whoever you want to name. But at the same time, they still have this capacity to, even in their kind of killed and bad states, to become, if not alive again or even relevant, but still have some sort of spark or some kind of just something about them that still works. And actually, the badness could be something you can aim at and produce, or the kind of tiredness, in fact, you can aim at and produce.
I wouldn't. This is where I think primacism is really helpful. Like genuinely, like it's like one of the reasons I wanted to share at least like the framing, in that it's like, seek not the text but the site of the text. The question is not will the novel live, but where will the novel be read? How will the novel be encountered?
Exactly.
And what is that space in an individual's life where a text might be able to be placed, where you might be able to forge space for a text? Like kind of again, like this, again, not to speak to the Exodus project, but the idea that like to go into the chain and put text there, to create a mechanic or gambits by which people might be directed to those texts, directed to them time and again, to force them to return to the text, to create sites of return, to create cycles of observation. Yes, the bookstore may not survive. Yes, like kind of some of the conventions of the 20th century space where the novel was present may not survive, but that also means that new opportunities will be created for where the text might be encountered. And as long as you find readers there, and as long as you find, like the gambit is, do you meet the reader? I think like kind of that's again like one of the most romantic aspects of Shelley, where so much of this is this like kind of both hopeful and desperate gambit with language, where he is. And that's why I like reading Shelley, 300 years after his death, like. In that every time anyone reads Shelley right now, that gambit is to some extent successful. It's really beautiful, and it's totally unknowable for Shelley, and a total space of the unknown. Like his world is in many ways gone, but the texts are continuing to forge this path, this bizarre path through time. And I would say that like kind of. I think the late 20th century focused so much on the ego and the presence of the writer, the living writer, the celebrity, the celebre, the idea even that like autofiction, that like the role of writing actually was to kind of venerate the life. And it's like, no, it's the exact opposite. The role of writing is to be a text. And it's text that the reader encounters. And that the most beautiful thing in the world for me is when that text can be liberated from time and from the space of the writer. The writer is able to successfully find a means to let that text actually be encountered by a reader, and for for that encounter to possibly continue to occur and happen amongst many readers, and therefore the text becomes useful, and therefore it becomes valuable. I know you said you wanted to speak of value at some point in this talk. But I would just say to Layla that, like, I think this is actually like a time where it's a wonderful imperative to write now, and that the space of text is changing, and the site of text is changing, and the spaces we share text is changing, and to charge those spaces with resonant, meaningful things is an amazing imperative that I think writers can embrace.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll draw things to a close there. I've got one more thing to say, which I'll say in a sec. Before that, I meant to mention this earlier, but I'll bring it up now, which is that we do have a POAP, proof of active participation, NFT, for this call tonight. I'll put some details in the Telegram group, because to be perfectly honest, I'm still not 100% sure I understand the mechanism for claiming them, but I'll try and work that out and then put it in the group. And then to finish, I am going to, if you forgive me, David, I'm going to read out the final poem, number 19 in Exodus 2, and invite you to imagine what kind of intellect will be reading this and what they'll be thinking about it in almost 40 years' time. Hijacked forms, waves, body poem, dazzling equinox, selbst Verselbstlichung. I almost got that. I almost pronounced that correctly. I should have practiced it more. But anyway, there we go.
No,
maybe German won't exist in 40 years, and
it's actually quite
they'll be like, what's he saying?
No, it's actually quite cool to trip up over it. I mean, that's language like running aground, right? That's just like
exactly. Yeah,
that's the bathos of that last tangle. It's a horrid way to close, I guess. But,
no, it's great. I love it. It's a sort of couldn't imagine it kind of ending in a more perfect way.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you so much.
That's all right. I have to sign off. I wanted to say a huge thanks. I've really enjoyed this so much. Wish we could have gone on for at least twice as long. I feel like there's so many things that we didn't really get to cover. But I don't know. Maybe we could do this again next unlock, or the unlock after, before it starts to be years in between unlocks. So who knows? Watch this space. Yeah, that's